Tonight we walk through the amber glow of a Georgian drawing room, where the last light of day spills across floorboards worn smooth by 2 centuries of footsteps. You press your palm against the window frame, and the wood, painted and repainted so many times that the corners have softened into curves, still holds the faint warmth of the afternoon that just slipped away. Outside, the street settles into that blue hour when gas lamps begin their sputter and hiss, but you remain here, watching dust motes perform their slow waltz in the final shaft of sunlight angling through 12/12 panes. This room was built for this moment. Not for the harsh morning glare that would send servants scrambling to pull blinds, not for the flat midday light that makes every portrait look slightly stern, but for this, the long, honeyed reach of the sun as it makes its last polite call before dinner. You probably won't survive this, of course. The 18th century had a dismal track record with fevers, and that lead paint you're leaning against isn't doing your nervous system any favors. But for now, in this suspended minute, you understand something that the women in silk and men in powdered wigs understood instinctively. A room is not just walls and a ceiling, but a vessel carefully tilted to catch the light. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand there, forehead almost touching the cool glass, and you begin to notice things you never saw before. The window recess is deep enough to sit in, the sill wide as a small bench, and you realize this was deliberate. Georgian architects didn't punch holes in walls and hope for the best. They sculpted these openings like lenses, calculating the angle of the reveal so that the maximum amount of late light would refract into the room rather than simply bounce off the exterior. Your eye follows the shadow line creeping across the floor, and you see it align almost perfectly with the edge of the Persian carpet, as if the sun itself consulted the interior decorator. This is not coincidence. This is the result of decisions made at drawing boards in smoky London coffee houses, where architects compared notes over cups of chocolate and argued about whether a 15-degree splay on the window jamb was worth the extra mason's wages. The glass itself holds stories you can't quite read. It's old glass, crown glass probably, and it refuses to be perfectly flat. You move your head slightly and the world outside warps and swims, a cart passing by stretching like taffy before snapping back to reality. These imperfections, these gentle undulations, they catch the afternoon light and scatter it in ways modern float glass never could. The whole room breathes with a kind of shimmer, as if the air itself has grown slightly luminous. You run your finger along the leading that holds the panes together, and you feel the slight tackiness of old putty, replaced who knows how many times over the decades, but always respecting the original geometry. Behind you, the room stretches away into shadow. A harpsichord stands against the far wall, its lid closed, the curves of its legs just visible in the gathering dusk. Above the fireplace, a portrait of some long-dead merchant gazes into the middle distance, and you notice that his eyes catch a glint of the dying light, as if the painter understood that this room would always perform this trick at this hour. The mantelpiece clock ticks with the unhurried confidence of something that has outlasted everyone who ever wound it. And you, standing at the window, become part of the room's long memory. This moment, this precise conjunction of architecture and astronomy, did not happen by chance. Someone, some 250 years ago, stood on this very spot during construction and squinted at the sky, then shouted down to the bricklayers to shift the opening another 6 inches west. Someone else, the carpenter perhaps, argued that the lintel couldn't bear the weight if they widened it further, and they reached a compromise that still stands today. The window tax assessor came by periodically, counting panes, calculating levies, never realizing that the thing he taxed was less a hole in the wall and more a precision instrument for capturing light. As the last sliver of sun dips behind the rooftops across the square, the room performs its final trick. The warm tones drain away slowly, like water from a bath, leaving behind a cool lavender twilight that seems to emanate from the walls themselves. You step back from the window, and your reflection ghosts across the glass for just a moment before disappearing. The room has served its purpose for another day. Tomorrow afternoon, if you return, the light will find this window again, as reliably as the tide, and it will pour through these imperfect panes to warm these same floorboards, these same faded carpets, these same patient walls. But that is tomorrow. For now, in the growing dark, you understand that Georgian architects did not simply build houses. They built instruments for experiencing time itself, one afternoon at a time. You back away from the window, and the room dims around you, but your mind still glows with that golden after-image. To understand what you just witnessed, you need to go backwards, not just in time, but in architectural thinking. You need to experience the darkness that Georgian architects rebelled against. So let the front door close softly behind you, and step into the warren of rooms that came before. You're walking through a medieval hall now, somewhere in the English countryside, and the year has not yet learned to call itself Georgian. The floor beneath your feet is rushes strewn over packed earth, and they crackle with something that might be dried herbs or might be last week's dinner bones. You try not to think about it. The walls are stone, thick as your arm is long, and the windows, you almost miss them at first, are narrow slits sliced deep into the masonry, more suitable for shooting arrows through than for admitting light. You press your cheek against the cold stone to look through one of these openings, and you understand immediately that no one built this for your comfort. The glass, if it exists at all, is tiny panes of greenish coral held in place by iron bars, so clouded with impurities that the outside world appears as a suggestion rather than a view. The afternoon sun, that same sun that later centuries would worship, struggles through these apertures like a traveler pushing through a crowd, arriving in the hall exhausted and diminished. The light falls in narrow strips across the floor, leaving vast stretches of the room in a gloom so profound that you can barely make out the figures huddled around the central hearth. The smoke from that fire rises toward a louver in the roof, but much of it lingers at head height, stinging your eyes and blurring everything with a blue haze. This, you realize, is what people accepted as indoor life for centuries. This is the darkness that Georgian architects would eventually declare war on. You wander through the centuries, watching windows slowly evolve, and it's like watching someone learn to open their eyes. In Tudor times, someone figures out that if you group several narrow windows together in a bay, you get something almost like a bright room. You stand in a great chamber at Hampton Court, and the oriel window projects outward like a glass bubble catching light from three directions. But even here, the individual panes remain small, held together by thick lead cames that carve the view into fragments. The stone mullions between each light cast heavy shadows across the room, striping the floor with dark bars that move as the day progresses. You follow one of those shadow lines across the rush matting, and you notice how it falls across a seated figure, some courtier, perhaps, who has positioned himself exactly where the light will warm his face for an hour each afternoon. Even in these dimmer times, people understood the value of what little sun they could capture. Then the 17th century arrives, and something shifts. You stand in a room built just after the Restoration, and the windows have grown taller, wider, more confident. The mullions have retreated, the transoms have lifted, and for the first time, you feel like the room is looking outward rather than inward. The glass itself has improved, smaller bubbles, fewer waves, but it's still divided into those small panes, still held in check by technology that hasn't quite caught up with ambition. You run your hand along the wooden frame, and you notice something new: the window slides. Not much, just a few inches, but it moves vertically in its frame, held in place by a simple peg. This is the ancestor of the sash window, crude and heavy, but already suggesting the possibilities to come. Outside, in the formal gardens that stretch away from the house, you see the other half of the equation taking shape. Gardeners are laying out parterres and avenues with an eye towards something that looks almost like architecture. They cut vistas through woodland, align paths with the setting sun, create outdoor rooms that capture light at specific hours. the house and garden begin to converse with each other, and you realize that the window is the mouth through which they speak. A window that opens onto a carefully designed landscape isn't just an opening. It's a frame for a composition, a proscenium arch through which nature performs. But even with these advances, you're not in the room you stood in earlier. The afternoon light still enters these restoration interiors as a guest rather than the guest of honor. The architects haven't yet learned to tilt their buildings toward the sun, to orient entire floor plans around the path of light across the sky. They still think of windows as things to be placed symmetrically on facades, to balance elevations and satisfy classical proportions. The idea that a window might have a job to do, a specific task related to the time of day, hasn't fully formed. Historians still argue whether the shift happened gradually or in sudden leaps. Some point to the Great Fire of London in 1666 as a turning point. When the city rebuilt, it rebuilt with larger windows and lighter rooms, and the change spread outward from there. Others argue that the key moment came earlier, when Inigo Jones returned from Italy with Renaissance ideas about proportion and light, ideas that slowly filtered through English building practice like water through limestone. Still others suggest that the real driver was simply money, the growing wealth of the merchant class, who wanted homes that displayed their prosperity, and what better display than expensive glass opening onto expensive views. You stand at the threshold of the 18th century, looking back at the long, slow brightening of domestic life, and forward to the golden rooms you've already glimpsed. The stage is set. The technology is nearly ready. The desire for light has become something like hunger. All that remains is for the Georgian architects to take those deep window reveals, those sliding sashes, those hard-won improvements in glass, and combine them with an understanding of the sun itself. They're about to discover that the afternoon light isn't just something that happens to a room, it's something a room can be built to deserve. You stand now on the roof of a Georgian townhouse, somewhere in Bath perhaps, or maybe one of those tidy squares in Bloomsbury, and the architect has handed you something you don't quite expect, a pocket sundial. It's warm from his waistcoat, the brass slightly polished by years of thumbing, and he gestures for you to hold it flat in your palm while he explains something that every Georgian builder understood instinctively but rarely wrote down. The sun, he tells you, is not your enemy. It is not your servant. It is a contract. Every day it rises in the east, climbs to its zenith, and declines toward the west, and every day it offers you the same hours of light in the same sequence. Your job, as someone who builds rooms for people to live in, is to decide which of those hours you want to capture. You turn slowly on the rooftop, feeling the lead sheets warm beneath your feet, and you begin to see the city below you as a kind of sundial itself. The roof's pitch at angles calculated centuries ago for draining rain, but also, you now realize, for catching or deflecting sun. The chimney stacks cast long shadows that will shorten toward noon then lengthen again, and somewhere below, someone has positioned a breakfast room to catch the eastern light, a library to avoid the glare that would damage book spines, and a drawing room, that drawing room you stood in earlier, angled precisely to receive the afternoon's last offering. You're not just looking at buildings anymore. You're looking at a conversation between masonry and astronomy. The architect takes back his sundial and begins to explain the geometry of it all, but his language shifts into something almost musical. He talks about the sun's path as if it were a dance, with fixed steps repeated each day but shifting slightly with the seasons. In summer, the sun rides high, nearly overhead at noon, and its rays plunge steeply into courtyards and light wells. In winter, it skims low across the southern sky, reaching deep into rooms that summer sun never touches. A room oriented to catch that low winter sun might stay dark for half the year, then suddenly fill with light when you need warmth most. The architects who understood this didn't just build houses, they choreographed annual performances of light and shadow. You descend from the roof and walk the streets, and now you can't stop noticing the evidence of this understanding everywhere. Look at that terrace, how the front facades all face the street regardless of direction, because symmetry and civic order demanded it. But walk around to the garden side, and suddenly the buildings have opinions. They lean toward the southwest, their garden fronts almost uniformly angled to catch that precious afternoon light. The street front was for show, for passers-by and tax assessors and the judgment of neighbors. The garden front was for living, for afternoon tea and evening conversation, and it oriented itself accordingly. Inside a house under construction, you watch the bricklayers at work, and you notice how they treat different windows differently. The morning rooms, facing east, get wider openings, shallower reveals, because morning light needs all the help it can get to penetrate a room. The afternoon rooms, facing west, have deeper reveals, splayed jambs that act like funnels, gathering the horizontal rays and spreading them across the interior. The difference is subtle. You might walk past these houses 1,000 times without noticing, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. The building itself is a kind of clock, marking hours not with hands but with pools of light. You step into a house where construction has reached the plastering stage, and the craftsmen are putting up the decorative ceiling moldings. Even here, in what seems purely ornamental, the light shapes the work. The deepest relief, the most intricate plasterwork, always appears on the walls and ceilings that catch the afternoon sun. Why spend months carving fruit and flowers into plaster if no one will ever see them? The afternoon light animates these details, dragging shadows across the surfaces, making the ornament dance as the sun moves. Rooms that face other directions get flatter, simpler treatments, beautiful in their own way, but designed for gentle illumination rather than dramatic display. The furniture makers, you discover, understood this too. You visit a cabinet maker's workshop, and he shows you how chairs and tables were positioned not just for conversation but for light. The chairs that catch the afternoon sun have their fabrics chosen carefully. Darker colors that won't fade, heavier weaves that resist the bleaching effect of repeated exposure. The chairs that live in permanent shadow can afford lighter silks, more delicate embroideries, because they'll never suffer the sun's slow violence. Even the placement of mirrors follows the light, positioned to reflect that golden afternoon glow deeper into rooms the sun can't reach directly. Historians still argue whether this knowledge was passed down through formal training or absorbed through simple observation. The great architectural pattern books of the era, those hefty volumes that gentlemen kept in their libraries and builders consulted on site, say surprisingly little about solar orientation. They'll give you page after page of classical orders, cornice profiles, window proportions, but they rarely mention which way the windows should face. And yet the buildings themselves tell a different story. They're so consistently oriented toward the afternoon sun that it can't be coincidence. Some knowledge, apparently, traveled not through books but through the simple act of paying attention. You find yourself back in that drawing room as evening approaches again, but this time you understand more. The light that fills this room isn't random. It's the result of decisions made at every scale, from the orientation of the entire terrace to the depth of this single window reveal. The sun traces its daily arc across the sky, and this building, this room, this window, has been shaped to intercept it at exactly this hour. You're not just watching the sunset. You're watching a contract fulfilled, a promise made by long-dead builders to a sun that keeps showing up. You walk up the staircase now, and something shifts halfway through your ascent. The treads beneath your feet narrow slightly as you rise, a trick of perspective that makes the journey feel longer than it is, and the light changes with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, the hall remains in that dignified gloom appropriate for receiving visitors, but as you climb, the air brightens. By the time you reach the first landing, you're standing in a pool of afternoon light so warm you could almost bathe in it. This is no accident. You've just entered the piano nobile, the principal floor, and everything about this level announces that you've arrived somewhere important. The Georgians inherited the piano nobile from their Italian Renaissance predecessors, but they adapted it with an obsession that would have made Palladio raise an eyebrow. In the great houses of Italy, The principal floor often sat raised above a rusticated ground level for reasons of security and status, but the English took this elevation and turned it into a mechanism for capturing light. You stand at the window on this first floor, and you're already higher than the garden wall, higher than the mews across the way, high enough that the afternoon sun reaches you long before it touches the ground below. This elevation, this deliberate raising of the best rooms above the street, isn't just about hierarchy. It's about harvesting light that would otherwise be lost. You turn from the window and survey the room behind you, and now you understand why Georgian architects arranged these spaces the way they did. The piano nobile contains the reception rooms, the drawing room where you stood earlier, the dining room where the family entertains, perhaps a library or music room depending on the wealth of the owner. These are the rooms where life happens, where guests are impressed, where the family spends its waking hours when not sleeping or cooking. And every single one of these rooms, in a properly designed Georgian house, faces toward the afternoon sun. Not the morning sun, which arrives too early for polite society, and not the noon sun, which is harsh and unforgiving, but the afternoon sun, that mellow golden light that flatters complexions and softens conversations. You walk through the enfilade, that series of connecting doors that allows you to see straight through the entire suite of rooms, and the afternoon light streams through each room in turn, creating a cascade of brightness that draws you forward. The doors align perfectly, so that standing at one end of the house, you can see clear through to the garden at the other, and at this hour, the view is nothing but light. The architects designed these sight lines deliberately, knowing that a visitor arriving for afternoon tea would be seduced before they even sat down, drawn through pool after pool of golden illumination toward the company waiting at the far end. The proportions of these rooms follow rules as strict as any musical composition. You pace out the dimensions, twice as long as they are wide, tall enough that the windows seem to reach for the ceiling, and you realize that these proportions were chosen partly for their relationship to light. A room that's too shallow will flood with brightness, bleaching everything into flatness. A room that's too deep will swallow the light before it reaches the far wall. But these rooms, these perfectly calculated Georgian reception rooms, take the afternoon sun and stretch it, spread it, soften it until it wraps around you like a shawl. The ceiling height allows the light to bounce and diffuse, so that even the corners farthest from the windows receive a share of the glow. You notice the colors, too. The walls aren't the stark white you might expect from a culture obsessed with light. They're soft greens, pale blues, warm creams, colors that catch the afternoon sun and transform it, absorbing some wavelengths and reflecting others. The pigment makers of the 18th century understood that light isn't just brightness but color, and they mixed their paints accordingly. A green that looks muddy in the morning becomes luminous at 4 o'clock. A blue that seems cold at noon warms to something almost Mediterranean when the sun drops toward the horizon. The Georgians didn't just build rooms for light, they painted them for specific hours. In one corner, you spot a piece of furniture that seems designed for this very moment. It's a sofa, but not like any you've seen before, curved slightly, almost like a section of a circle, positioned so that it follows the arc of the afternoon light as it moves across the room. You sit in it, and you realize that someone who knew what they were doing placed this here. From this spot, you can watch the light travel across the floor, across the opposite wall, across the faces of your companions, without ever having to move. You've become a fixed point around which the afternoon revolves. The social rituals of the Georgians start to make sense from this seated position. Afternoon calls, tea drinking, card playing. All these activities happened in rooms designed for exactly this light. You imagine a group of friends gathered here, the women in their silks, the men in their velvet coats, all of them bathed in that forgiving glow that smoothed wrinkles and softened judgments. The conversation would have flowed differently in this light than it would in the harsh morning or the candlelit evening. This was the hour for confidences, for flirtations, for the kind of talk that happens when everyone feels slightly more beautiful than they actually are. Historians still argue whether the Georgians consciously designed their social rituals around the availability of light, or whether the architecture shaped the rituals unconsciously. Did afternoon tea become the great social institution of the 18th century because the houses were built to make that hour magical? Or did the architects build those houses because afternoon tea was already becoming fashionable? The chicken and the egg refused to declare a winner. But standing here, in this room, at this hour, you suspect the question doesn't really matter. The architecture and the ritual married so completely that they became the same thing. You rise from the curved sofa and walk toward the window as the light begins its final deepening. Below, in the garden, you can see the shadows lengthening across the lawn, the flower beds losing their sharp colors as evening approaches. But up here, in the piano nobile, the light still holds. The room seems to concentrate what's left of the day, holding it close, refusing to let go until the very last moment. When the sun finally dips below the horizon, this room will be the last in the house to surrender to darkness. That was the whole point. You slip away from the elegant drawing room now, leaving the silk and conversation behind, and you find a narrow door tucked discreetly beside the grand staircase. It's the sort of door that Georgian architects designed to be invisible. Same wood, same paneling, same careful joinery, but positioned so that guests would never notice it unless they were looking. You push it open, and immediately everything changes. The ceiling drops, the walls close in, and you're standing on a staircase that feels like it belongs in a different building entirely. These are the back stairs, the servant stairs, and they tell a different story about Georgian windows and the afternoon light. You start your descent, and the first thing you notice is the windows. They're here, but they're not like the generous sash windows upstairs. These are narrow, vertical slots, tucked into corners, positioned more for ventilation than for view. And yet, as you continue down, you begin to see that they're doing something more interesting than you first realized. The afternoon light, that same golden light you worshipped upstairs, finds its way into this service stairwell through a series of carefully placed openings that catch it at different angles on each landing. You're not walking down a dark hole. You're descending through a shaft of light that has been broken into segments, distributed like portions to each level. The architect, you now understand, treated this back stair as a kind of light engine. The windows aren't placed randomly or simply for the convenience of servant hurrying with coal scuttles and tea trays. They're positioned to capture light at specific times of day, to funnel it down into the basement kitchens and up into the upper servant quarters, to distribute whatever illumination can be spared from the grand rooms above. The servants who use these stairs 100 times a day may not have consciously noticed the geometry at work, but they benefited from it every time they passed a landing and found, for just a moment, their faces warmed by a shaft of afternoon sun. You reach the basement level, and the air changes, cooler, damper, smelling of coal dust and cold ashes and the faint, lingering ghost of yesterday's dinner. The kitchen stretches out before you, vast and low-ceilinged, and here the windows tell an entirely different story. They face east, these kitchen windows, catching the morning light that would have been wasted on sleeping gentry. The afternoon sun, so precious upstairs, barely touches this room. By the time the golden hour arrives in the drawing room, the kitchen staff are already deep in the shadows, working by the glow of candles and the fire's uncertain light. You walk through the kitchen, running your hand along a massive wooden table scarred by decades of chopping, and you begin to understand the hierarchy of light in a Georgian house. It wasn't just about who got the best rooms, it was about who got the best hours. The family took the afternoon, that long, luxurious stretch of gentle illumination. The servants made do with morning, when the light was harsher and the work was harder. By the time the sun reached its most beautiful angle, the people who made this house function were already laboring in relative darkness, preparing the very meals that would be enjoyed in those golden rooms above. But even here, in the servants' domain, the architect's obsession with light didn't entirely disappear. You notice a curious feature in the kitchen wall. A small window, high up, that doesn't open to the outside at all. Instead, it looks into a light well, a vertical shaft that rises all the way to the garden above. This borrowed light, as the Georgians called it, allowed a few precious rays to reach rooms that had no direct access to the exterior. You stand beneath it, and sure enough, a faint glow filters down, not enough to read by, but enough to soften the darkness, to remind you that the sun still exists somewhere above. You climb another set of stairs, these even narrower than the last, and you emerge in the attic rooms where the upper servants slept. Here, the windows are tiny dormers punched through the roof slope, and they face whatever direction the roof happened to face. But even in these cramped quarters, you notice something touching. The dormer windows that catch the afternoon light, the ones facing west, have been positioned slightly differently from the others. They're larger, just by a few inches, and the sills are deeper, wide enough to sit on. Some long-dead chambermaid, you realize, made this space her own by claiming the afternoon light. She would have sat here in her few free moments, looking out over the rooftops, warming herself in the same sun that bathed her mistress in the drawing room below. The contrast between these servant spaces and the grand rooms upstairs tells you something profound about Georgian values. Light was a commodity, like coal or candles, and it was distributed according to status. The best light went to the best rooms, the best hours went to the best people, and everyone else made do with what remained. And yet, even within this rigid hierarchy, the architects found ways to spread the wealth. Those borrowed light shafts, those carefully positioned stair windows, those slightly enlarged dormers, they represent small acts of generosity built into the fabric of the house, moments when the architect thought about the servants who would inhabit these shadows. You find yourself back on the ground floor, in the hallway outside the kitchen, and you notice one last window. It's set into the wall beside the service door, and it's positioned so that anyone approaching the house from the back, the milkmaid, the coal man, the boy delivering newspapers, would be framed in afternoon light as they knocked. The architect, you realize, thought about everyone. Not just the family, not just the servants, but even the temporary visitors who would spend only moments in this house. For those few seconds, as they waited for the door to open, they too would receive their share of the golden hour. Historians still argue whether this attention to servant spaces was motivated by genuine concern or simple practicality. Did the architects design these light-filled service areas because they believed servants deserved dignity, or because well-lit servants worked more efficiently and made fewer mistakes? The answer probably lies somewhere in the middle, as most answers do. But standing here, watching a shaft of afternoon light filter down through that borrowed light window into the kitchen below, you prefer to believe it was a little of both. The Georgians were practical people, but they were also capable of small generosities, and sometimes those generosities took the form of light. You walk back through the kitchen and up the main stairs, but instead of returning to the drawing room, you pause at a different door on the piano nobile. This one leads to a smaller chamber, more intimate than the grand reception rooms, and as you enter, you immediately understand why. The entire far wall curves outward in a gentle bow, and set into that curve are windows. 3 of them, maybe 4, arranged so that they follow the arc of the wall and catch light from almost every angle. You found the oriel window, or rather, you found the Georgian descendant of that medieval feature, evolved now into something altogether more sophisticated, the bay window as sunset seat. You move toward it, and the room seems to pull you forward, that curved wall acting like a magnet drawing you into the light. By the time you reach the windows, you're standing in a semicircular alcove that projects out from the main facade, wrapped on 3 sides by glass. The afternoon sun, which from other windows in this house arrives at an angle, here surrounds you. It comes from the left, from the right, from straight ahead, and the effect is like standing inside a lantern. You're not just observing the light anymore, you're immersed in it. This, you realize, was the most fought-over spot in any Georgian house. Not the grand drawing room with its enfilade views, not the library with its learned volumes, But this small curved alcove where one person could sit alone or two could share an intimate conversation while bathed in the last warmth of the day. You sink onto the built-in seat that runs along the curve of the bay, and the cushions, though modern replacements, have been chosen in a fabric that seems to glow in this light. You understand immediately why Georgian gentlemen scheme to claim this spot during afternoon card games, positioning themselves here hours in advance, inventing excuses to linger, all for the privilege of spending the golden hour in this glassy throne. The architecture of the oriel window tells you something about how the Georgians thought about privacy and display. From inside, you have a panoramic view of the street or garden, an unbroken sweep of vision that makes you feel like you're surveying your domain. But from outside, you're visible too, a silhouette in a lantern, framed by glass and light. To sit in an oriel window at the golden hour was to perform a kind of theatre, to present yourself to the world as a figure of leisure and taste, bathed in the most flattering illumination nature could provide. The neighbors walking past would see you there, would note your choice of seat, would understand without being told that you were a person who knew how to live. You look out through the curved glass, and the distortion is even more pronounced here than in the flat windows. The street outside bends and stretches as you move your head, the passers-by elongating then compressing as they cross your field of vision. This wasn't a flaw in the glass, it was a feature of the experience, a gentle reminder that what you were seeing was filtered through something man-made, something that transformed the world even as it revealed it. The Georgian gentleman in this seat would have been acutely aware of his own position, framed by architecture, illuminated by nature, observed by society. The card tables in the main part of the room stand ready for the evening's entertainments, but for now, in this late afternoon hour, they're empty. The real action happens here, in the bay. You imagine the players gathering, not around the tables but around this window, drawn by the light as moths to a flame. The conversation would have been different here than in the rest of the room. More relaxed, more confidential, the kind of talk that happens when people are comfortable and warm and slightly sleepy from the day's last sun. The cards, when they finally came out, would be dealt in this glow, the faces and suits illuminated more kindly than any candle could manage. You notice that the seat you're on has been worn smooth by generations of sitters. The wood is polished to a deeper shine here than elsewhere in the room, the fabric of the cushion, though replaced many times, always chosen in colors that complement the afternoon light. This spot has been loved, has been claimed and reclaimed by countless occupants over 2.5 centuries, each of them understanding instinctively what the architect intended. This was not just a window. This was a destination. The view from this particular bay looks out over a garden square, one of those private parks that made Georgian London livable. You watch as the afternoon light moves across the plane trees, gilding the leaves, throwing long shadows across the grass. A few children still play out there, their nurses keeping a watchful eye, but most of the square's residents have retreated indoors for the hour before dinner. You, like them, are exactly where you should be. In a warm room, in a comfortable seat, watching the day decline in perfect comfort. Historians still argue whether the oriel window's popularity in Georgian architecture came from practical or aesthetic motives. The practical argument says that projecting bays simply captured more light, that the geometry of a curved or angled window admitted sun from a wider arc of the sky than any flat window could manage. The aesthetic argument says that Georgians loved the drama of these protruding forms, the way they broke up the straight lines of terraces and added interest to facades. But sitting here, wrapped in afternoon warmth, you suspect the true answer is simpler. The Georgians loved oriel windows because they felt good. Because on a late autumn afternoon, there was no better place in the world to be. You lean your head against the window frame, and the wood, warmed by hours of sun, cradles your temple. Outside, a carriage passes, the horse's hooves muffled by the soft earth of the square's perimeter road. Inside, the room holds its breath. This moment, this particular configuration of light and architecture and human comfort, was designed to be savored. The architect who drew this bay, who calculated its curve and positioned its windows, did so knowing that someone, someday, would sit here and feel exactly what you're feeling now. That was the whole point. That was the gift. You rise from the oriel window seat, but you're not ready to leave this room yet. Instead, you walk to one of the flat windows along the sidewall, and you place your hands on the sash. The frame moves beneath your palms with a smoothness that seems almost alive, counterweights hidden in the jambs doing their silent work. You push up, and the lower sash rises effortlessly, stopping exactly where you want it, held in place by friction and balance rather than any visible catch. You've just performed an action that Georgian gentlemen and their servants performed thousands of times, an action so ordinary they probably never thought about it. But this window, this simple mechanism of wood, glass, and iron, is one of the most sophisticated light control devices ever invented. You slide the sash down again, then experiment with opening it from the top, letting the upper sash descend while the lower rises. The afternoon light responds to your adjustments like a living thing. With both sashes closed, the light enters in a broad, diffused sheet, softened by the imperfections in the glass. Open the bottom sash, and suddenly the air moves, the curtains stir, and the light becomes sharper, more direct, carrying with it the sounds of the street below. Open the top sash instead, and the light enters at a higher angle, falling on the ceiling rather than the floor, creating a different kind of atmosphere altogether. You're not just opening a window. You're tuning the room. The Georgians understood this intuitively. The sash window wasn't just a technological improvement over earlier casements, it was an instrument for modulating experience throughout the day. In the morning, you might open only the top sash, letting in fresh air without disturbing the delicate light of early hours. At noon, when the sun grew harsh, you might close everything tight, relying on the deep reveals and light-colored walls to soften what penetrated. But in the afternoon, in that golden hour you've been tracking, you would adjust and readjust constantly, chasing the perfect balance between light and air, between connection to the outdoors and comfortable seclusion. You run your fingers along the sash cords, those thick braided ropes that connect the window to its counterweights. They're modern replacements, of course. The originals rotted away long ago, but they follow the same principles. The weights hidden inside the frame are precisely calibrated to the window's mass, so that it stays where you put it without slipping or sticking. This was precision engineering in an age that had no power tools, no standardized parts, no way of ensuring that one window would match another except the skill of the joiner who made them. And yet, 2.5 centuries later, these windows still work. Still slide. Still tune the light. You step back and look at the window as a whole, considering its geometry. The typical Georgian sash has 6 panes in each sash, 12/12, as the trade calls it. Though you've seen variations, some with larger panes in the lower sash to admit more light at eye level, some with 9/9 in grander houses. The glazing bars that divide these panes aren't just structural necessities, though they do hold the glass in place. They're also light modulators, casting delicate shadows across the room as the sun moves, creating a kind of time-lapse animation on the floor and walls. You watch those shadows now, thin lines of darkness that creep across the boards with the afternoon's progress, and you realize you could tell time by them if you knew their language. The hardware tells its own story. You examine the brass catch that holds the sashes closed, the simple but elegant mechanism of the fastener. These were mass-produced by the 18th century, stamped out in Birmingham foundries and shipped across the country. But each one was installed by hand, adjusted by eye, made to work in this specific window. You lift the catch and feel its satisfying click, a sound that has marked the end of afternoons for hundreds of years. When that catch engages, it means the light has finally gone, the room has cooled, and the candles must be lit. But the sash window's relationship to afternoon light goes beyond simple adjustment. You notice something curious about the way the glass is set into the frame. The panes aren't flush with the outer surface, they're recessed slightly, creating a shallow well around each one. This recession catches the low afternoon sun in a particular way, casting each pane's shadow onto the glass beside it, creating a layered effect that makes the window seem deeper than it actually is. The architect who designed this understood that a window isn't just a hole. It's a series of planes, each interacting with light differently, each contributing to the final effect. You think about the people who would have operated this window over the centuries. The lady of the house, perhaps, adjusting it herself because she couldn't bear to wait for a servant. The housemaid whose daily routine included opening and closing every sash in the house, a task that could take an hour in a large establishment. The children, sneaking opens when they should have been at their lessons, letting in the sounds and smells of the street. The window remembers them all, not in any conscious way, but in the wear patterns on its frame, in the slight looseness of its joints, in the particular way it sticks just a little when you try to close it on humid days. Historians still argue whether the sash window was a British invention or whether it came from the Dutch, who were doing something similar across the North Sea. The patent records are unclear, the surviving examples ambiguous, and both nations claim credit with equal fervor. What's not in dispute is that the Georgians perfected it, took this simple mechanism and turned it into the defining feature of their architecture. You see sash windows everywhere in Georgian cities: Bath, Dublin, Edinburgh, London, and though they vary in proportion and detail, they all work on the same principles. They all tune the light. You slide the sash down one last time, closing it gently against the cooling evening air. The room settles into stillness, the faint sound of the street muffled once more by glass and frame. But you know that tomorrow afternoon, someone will lift this sash again. Maybe you, maybe someone else entirely, and the process will repeat. The light will return, the window will respond, and another day will be tuned to perfection. This window has done this thousands of times. It will do it thousands more. And each time, for a few perfect hours, it will make the afternoon light do exactly what the Georgians always wanted it to do: fill a room with gold. You leave the sash window closed for now and make your way back toward the stairs, but instead of ascending or descending, you pause at a door on the ground floor that you hadn't noticed before. It's plain, painted the same color as the surrounding woodwork but without the paneling that marks the more important rooms. You push it open, and immediately the temperature drops a few degrees. You've entered the servants' hall, the heart of the house's invisible workforce, and the light here tells a story you haven't heard yet. The room stretches before you, long and low-ceilinged, with a massive table running most of its length. This is where the servants ate, where they sat during their few hours of leisure, where they gathered in the evenings to sew and talk and perhaps doze by the fire. But look at the windows. They face east, every single one of them. The afternoon sun that you've beaming through the grand rooms upstairs never touches this space. By the time the golden hour arrives in the drawing room, the servants' hall has been in shadow for hours. The morning light that the gentry avoided, that harsh eastern glare that made the lady of the house reach for her sunshade, that was the servants' portion. You walk to one of the east-facing windows and look out. The view isn't much: a service yard, some outbuildings, the wall of the mews beyond. But in the morning, this window would have flooded the room with light, waking the servants who slept in the attics above, signaling the start of another 16-hour day. By afternoon, that light is long gone. The room now depends on whatever western light leaks in through doorways or borrowed lights, supplemented by candles that the household accounts tracked with miserly precision. You imagine the servants sitting down to their own dinner at 4 o'clock, eating in a room already dim, while above them the family prepared to dine in the last of the sun. You move through the rest of the service areas, and the pattern holds. The still room, where jams and pickles were made, faces north, cool and constant, perfect for preserving but offering nothing in the way of afternoon cheer. The laundry, steamy and hot even on cold days, gets whatever light it can from high windows that admit air but little else. The housekeeper's room, the one relatively comfortable space in the servants' domain, faces southeast, catching some morning sun but darkening well before the day's work ended. Only the butler's pantry, you notice, has a western window, a small one, high up, but definitely facing the afternoon sun. The butler, it seems, ranked high enough among the servants to deserve a share of the golden hour. You climb to the attic floor, where the servants slept, and the geography of light becomes even more stark. The best rooms, the ones for the upper servants, the lady's maid, the valet, face south or west, catching whatever sun penetrates through the dormer windows. But the smaller rooms, the cramped cubicles where the lower maid slept 2 or 3 to a space, face north or east, or worse, have no windows at all, relying on borrowed light from the corridor. The hierarchy of the servant world, invisible to guests and barely acknowledged by the family, is written in the orientation of these windows. Your place in the pecking order determined not just the size of your room but the quality of your light. You find one particular attic room that stops you. It's tiny, barely larger than a cupboard, with a single dormer window facing west. The window is smaller than the ones you've seen elsewhere, and the ceiling slopes so sharply that you can only stand upright in the center of the room. But someone has made this space their own. The windowsill is worn smooth from years of elbows resting on it. A small shelf beside the window holds a candlestick and a book, the leather cover cracked with age. And on the wall beside the window, faint but visible, there's a pencil mark, a date, 1793, and a name, Mary A., written in a careful, uneducated hand. Mary A., whoever she was, claimed this window. She sat here in the afternoons on her rare hours off, warming herself in the same sun that warmed her mistress, reading her book until the light failed. This tiny room, this smallest share of the house's light, was her refuge. You descend again, past the servants' hall, past the kitchen, down to the basement level where the heaviest work happened. Here, in the scullery and the coal store and the beer cellar, windows are almost non-existent. The few that exist are tiny, set high in the walls, barred against intruders, and they face whatever direction the street above dictated. The people who worked here, the scullery maids who scrubbed pots from dawn until midnight, the footmen who carried coal until their backs gave out, spent their entire days in artificial light, emerging into the sun only when their work was done. The afternoon light that you've been celebrating, that golden gift of the Georgian architect, never touched them at all. You stand in the scullery, looking up at one of those high, barred windows, and you think about the choices the architect made. He could have oriented the service areas differently. He could have given the kitchen a western window, let the cook work in afternoon light. But that would have meant sacrificing some other rooms' access to that precious western exposure, and in the hierarchy of the Georgian house, there was never any question which rooms would win. The family got the light. The servants got what remained. This wasn't cruelty, it was simply the way the world worked, the assumptions baked into every decision the architect made. Historians still argue whether the Georgians ever questioned this distribution. There's evidence in some houses of later modifications, windows added to service areas, light wells cut through floors, that suggest someone, at some point, thought the servants deserved better. But for the most part, the pattern held. The afternoon light was too valuable to waste on boiling mutton. The golden hour belonged to the people who could sit still and appreciate it, not to the people who were still working. You turn away from the scullery window and begin the long climb back up. The house settles around you, its layers of light and shadow stacked like geological strata. At the top, the attics, where servants caught whatever sun they could steal. Below that, the piano nobile, where the family basked in the full glory of the afternoon. And at the bottom, the basement, where some people never saw the sun at all. You carry this knowledge with you as you climb, and it changes how you see the golden rooms above. They're still beautiful. The light is still magical. But you understand now that this magic had a price, and that price was paid in darkness. You emerge from the servants' stairs onto the ground floor, But instead of returning to the front of the house, you walk straight through to the back door. The garden door, they called it, and it's grander than you expected. Tall, with a fanlight above that spills afternoon light onto the floor of the corridor. You turn the handle, step outside, and the full force of the western sun hits your face. You're standing on the terrace, looking out over the garden, and for the first time you see the house from the outside, from the angle that matters most. The garden front spreads before you like a revelation. You've seen the street front, of course, the polite symmetry, the regular windows, the careful proportions that made Georgian terraces the envy of Europe. But that facade was for the public, for passers-by and tax assessors and the judgment of neighbors. This facade, the garden front, was for the family. And it tells a different story entirely. The windows here are larger, more generous, arranged not for symmetry but for maximum capture of the afternoon light. The entire rear elevation tilts, not literally, but in its orientation, toward the southwest, toward the sun's daily decline. You're looking at a building that has turned its back on the street and opened its arms to the sky. You walk backward across the lawn, watching the house recede, and the geometry becomes clearer with every step. The garden front isn't flat, it curves and projects, with bays and bows and recesses that catch the light from different angles throughout the afternoon. The architect didn't just put windows in a wall. He sculpted the wall itself to embrace the sun. You count the bays, 3 on this house, though you've seen others with 5 or 7, and each one is positioned to catch the light at a slightly different hour. The easternmost bay catches the early afternoon, the central bay the peak, the westernmost the very last rays before sunset. The house, you realize, is a kind of sundial, its face turned toward the sun's path. You reach the end of the lawn and turn back to look. The house glows in the late light, its stone or brick warm to colors that don't exist at other times of day. The windows, dozens of them, flash and darken as clouds pass overhead, each pane a momentary mirror or a sudden transparency. You understand now why Georgian architects obsessed over garden frontages. The street front was duty. The garden front was desire. This is where they put their passion, their experiments, their best ideas about light and living. The garden itself, you notice, participates in this conversation. The paths are laid out to catch the afternoon sun, to offer walks that remain bright long after the house's shadow has crept across the lawn. The terrace directly outside the drawing room windows is paved in stone that absorbs heat all afternoon and releases it slowly into the evening, so that the family could step outside after dinner and find the air still warm. The flower beds are planted with species that open in the afternoon, that release their scent in the cooling air, that perform for an audience that only appears at this hour. The whole garden is a stage, and the house is the best seat in the house. You walk the gravel path that runs parallel to the garden front, and you notice how the windows change as you move. From this angle, you can see into rooms you've already visited, the drawing room where you started, the library, the morning room that faces east but catches some western light through its side windows. You see the servants moving inside, preparing for the evening, their silhouettes passing across the golden panes. From out here, the house seems alive, breathing, its windows like eyes that open and close as the light shifts. The relationship between house and garden, you now understand, was reciprocal. The garden wasn't just something to look at from the windows. It was something that shaped the light that entered those windows. The trees were positioned to filter the afternoon sun, to dapple it before it reached the glass. The lawn reflected light upward, illuminating ceilings that would otherwise have remained dark. The gravel paths bounced warm air toward the house, creating microclimates that extended the hours when the terrace was comfortable. The Georgians didn't just build houses in gardens. They built ecosystems of light and shadow, houses and gardens working together to capture every possible ray. You reach the end of the garden and turn to look back one more time. The sun has dropped lower now, and the house seems to float in its own glow. The windows that faced you directly a moment ago have become mirrors, reflecting the sky and trees, while the windows at the ends of the facade have deepened into pools of shadow. The building is changing by the minute, performing its evening transformation, and you're here to witness it. Historians still argue whether the Georgian obsession with garden frontages was aesthetic or practical. The aesthetic argument says that architects simply preferred the freedom of designing for the garden, where they could experiment without worrying about the street's formal requirements. The practical argument says that the garden front was where the family lived, and of course they would put their best work where it would be most appreciated. But standing here, watching the light play across this carefully oriented facade, you suspect the truth is both and neither. The Georgians loved the garden front because it worked. Because every afternoon, for a few perfect hours, it became the most beautiful thing in the world. You walk slowly back toward the house, the gravel crunching beneath your feet, and you realize that you've been outside longer than you meant to. The light has shifted again, deepening into that pre-sunset gold that painters tried and failed to capture. The windows ahead of you are darkening one by one as the sun drops behind the trees, but the house still holds the day's warmth. You'll be cold soon, you know, once you step inside. But for now, in this last moment of outdoor light, you stand and watch and remember. You're still standing on the lawn, watching the house perform its evening ritual, when you notice something that pulls your attention away from the building itself. Look at the trees, those mature limes and planes that line the garden boundaries, that frame the view from the drawing room windows. They're beautiful, certainly, their leaves shimmering in the last of the light. But as you watch, something happens. The sun drops another degree, and suddenly a branch that was harmless a moment ago becomes an obstacle. A shadow cuts across the drawing room window, bisecting it diagonally, and the golden glow you've been admiring falters. You're watching afternoon light collide with the one thing Georgian architects couldn't control, the living world. You walk toward that tree, and as you approach, you begin to understand the negotiations that must have happened here. The tree is old, older than the house, probably, planted long before the architect ever put pencil to paper. When the house was built, someone had to decide, keep the tree and accept the shadows, or cut it down and lose the maturity it brought to the garden. The architect, you imagine, argued for removal. The client, sentimentally attached to the tree his grandfather planted, refused. And so a compromise was reached, a negotiation etched into every afternoon for the next 2.5 centuries. The tree stayed. The light was diminished. And every day at this hour, the drawing room loses a slice of its golden hour to a branch that refuses to stop growing. You move to another part of the garden, where a different problem presents itself. Here, the shadow comes not from a tree but from the neighbor's house, a newer building, taller than this one, thrown up in a later century when the original Georgian square had already been established. The architect who built this house couldn't have anticipated that. He positioned his garden front to catch the maximum afternoon light based on the buildings that existed in his time. But cities change. Neighbors build upward. And suddenly, a room that was designed for golden afternoons finds itself in shadow at 4 o'clock. You wonder how many Georgian drawing rooms have suffered this fate, their carefully calculated orientations rendered obsolete by someone else's construction. Back inside, you climb to the top floor and look out over the neighboring roofs. From here, you can see the whole complex ecology of light and shadow that plays out across the city each afternoon. Some houses bask in full sun, their garden fronts unobstructed, their afternoon rooms glowing. Others are partially shaded, their light filtered through trees or broken by neighboring walls. A few, you notice, have been completely eclipsed, their windows dark even on the brightest day, their golden hours stolen by buildings that didn't exist when they were built. The city is a living thing, and its light is constantly shifting. You descend again and return to the drawing room, but instead of enjoying the light, you study its edges. That diagonal shadow from the lime tree is still there, creeping slowly across the floor as the sun moves. But something interesting is happening. The shadow isn't solid, it's dappled, broken by the leaves into thousands of tiny spots of darkness and light. The tree that steals the afternoon also transforms it, turning what would have been a simple wash of gold into something complex and moving. You watch as the dapples dance across the carpet, across the furniture, across your own hands, and you realize that this is its own kind of beauty. The architect might have hated that tree, but you're not so sure. There's something magical about this fractured light, something that a perfectly clear window could never achieve. The neighbors, too, have their compensations. The house that casts its shadow across this garden also receives shadows from elsewhere. No building in a city controls its own light completely. Every architect designs in conversation with existing structures, existing trees, existing patterns of sun and shade. The best of them anticipate these interactions, positioning windows not just for the light that will reach them but for the shadows that will inevitably fall. A truly skilled Georgian architect, you now understand, was as much a student of obstacles as of opportunities. You think about the negotiations that must have happened during construction. The letters between architect and client, preserved in some archive, arguing about whether to cut down that beloved oak. The meetings with neighbors, discussing the height of new wings and the shadows they would cast. The quiet resentments that simmered for decades as trees grew and shadows lengthened. Architecture isn't just about building. It's about managing relationships, with nature, with neighbors, with the future that no one can predict. Historians still argue whether Georgian architects had formal tools for predicting shadow patterns or whether they relied on observation and intuition. Some point to surviving diagrams that show shadow studies, rough sketches of how a building would cast shade at different times of day. Others argue that most architects simply built and hoped, trusting that the sun would find its way. The truth probably lies somewhere between. Some architects studied, some guessed, and many learned from their mistakes. The houses that survive, the ones that still catch the afternoon light perfectly, are the ones whose architects guessed right. You watch the dappled shadow continue its crawl across the floor, and you notice something else. The maid has entered the room to light the candles, and as she moves through the dapples, her apron catches the pattern. A moment of mobile beauty that will never repeat exactly. The tree, the light, the woman, the hour, all of them aligned for this single instant, then gone. The architect who fought that tree never saw this. Couldn't have seen it. But you do. And you understand that sometimes the obstacles create their own gifts. Outside, the sun continues to drop. The shadow from the lime tree lengthens, reaches across the entire drawing room now, and the dapples have merged into a general dimness. The golden hour is over, stolen or transformed or simply ended. It's hard to say which. But you know that tomorrow, the tree will still be there, the neighbor's house will still cast its shadow, and the light will still find its way through. The Georgians built for perfection, but they got something better. They got a conversation between their intentions and the world's refusal to cooperate. You turn away from the window, leaving the dappled shadows behind, and your eye catches something you hadn't noticed before. Above the drawing room door, set into the wall, there's a small rectangular window that doesn't open to the outside. It looks into the corridor beyond, borrowing light from the stairwell to supplement what enters this room. You've seen these before, borrowed lights, the Georgians called them, but now you look at them differently. They're not just architectural features. They're evidence of a compromise, a workaround, a response to one of the most absurd taxes ever devised. You walk through the house, and suddenly you see borrowed lights everywhere. Above interior doors, in internal walls, even in cupboards. Wherever a room needed light but couldn't get it directly from outside, the Georgians punched these small windows through. They're glazed, usually, with the same small panes as exterior windows, and they allow light to travel from room to room, from corridor to chamber, from the well-lit spaces to the dark ones. But why were they necessary? Why not just put windows in every external wall and be done with it? The answer, you discover, lies in a piece of legislation that shaped Georgian architecture more profoundly than any architect's vision. You step back in time, to 1696, when King William III needed money for his wars. The government, casting about for new sources of revenue, hit upon a brilliant and terrible idea: tax windows. The logic was simple enough. Windows were a measure of wealth. The more windows you had, the grander your house, the more you could afford to pay. So they imposed a tax on every window above a certain number, a tax that would increase for the next century and a half, shaping how every Georgian building was designed. You stand in this house, built well after the tax was established, and you realize that every window you've seen represents a financial decision as much as an aesthetic one. The tax assessors, you learn, counted windows ruthlessly. They didn't care about architectural merit or the needs of light. They counted panes, counted openings, levied their fees, and moved on. Householders responded with the creativity of people being squeezed by government. Some simply bricked up windows, leaving blind openings on their facades that you can still see on Georgian streets today, ghost windows that never admitted light. Others reduced the size of their windows, keeping the openings but minimizing the taxable area. And some, the clever ones, developed the borrowed light as a way of distributing illumination without triggering the taxman's wrath. You examine the borrowed light above the door more closely. It's a perfect example of Georgian ingenuity. The window doesn't open, so it doesn't count as a taxable window in the way the law was written. But it admits light from the corridor, which itself gets light from a staircase window that does count. The effect is to spread a single taxable window's worth of illumination across multiple rooms. The Georgians learned to make every window do the work of 2 or 3, stretching their light budget as carefully as they stretched their household budgets. You move through the house, mapping the paths of borrowed light. The stairwell window, you discover, illuminates not just the stairs but 3 separate corridors and 2 rooms, all through carefully positioned internal glazing. The drawing room's western windows, already taxed at the highest rate, send their afternoon glow through borrowed lights into the dining room beyond and the library upstairs. The whole house is networked with light, channeled and distributed like water through pipes. The tax that was meant to limit windows actually forced the Georgians to become virtuosos of light management. In one room, you find something extraordinary. A cupboard, deep and windowless, has been fitted with a small borrowed light that opens not into a corridor but into a light shaft, a vertical channel that rises through the house to a roof light far above. That single roof light, taxed as one window, illuminates a shaft that feeds borrowed lights on every floor, reaching rooms that would otherwise have been completely dark. You stand in the cupboard, and sure enough, a faint glow filters down from above, enough to see by, enough to find what you're looking for. The architect has turned a single tax liability into a system of illumination that serves the whole house. The glass in these borrowed lights, you notice, is often different from the exterior windows. It's thinner, sometimes, or more translucent, less concerned with weatherproofing and more with light transmission. Some of it is ground glass, frosted to provide privacy while still admitting illumination. The Georgians experimented constantly with these internal windows, trying different glasses, different positions, different angles, all to maximize the effect of every taxable ray. You find the house's original tax assessment in a drawer in the library, a yellow document listing every window, counting every pane, calculating the annual levy. The total is staggering, a significant percentage of what the house cost to build. You imagine the owner's reaction when that assessment arrived, his calculations about which windows to keep and which to sacrifice. Every window in this house survived a cost-benefit analysis. Every one justified its existence against the taxman's ledger. Historians still argue whether the window tax was a net positive or negative for British architecture. The negative case is obvious. It reduced natural light in thousands of homes, encouraged the blocking up of windows, and created dark, unhealthy interiors. But some scholars argue that the tax forced innovation, that the borrowed light and the light shaft and the careful distribution of illumination through internal glazing represent real advances in architectural thinking. Without the tax, they suggest, Georgian houses might have been more generously windowed but less cleverly lit. It's a debate that will never be settled, because you can't run the experiment both ways. You look again at the borrowed light above the door, and you see it differently now. It's not just a feature, it's a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. Someone looked at an absurd law and found a way around it, not by cheating but by thinking differently about what a window could be. That borrowed light is a small act of rebellion, a quiet victory over bureaucracy, a reminder that architects don't just serve their clients, they serve light itself, and they'll find a way to deliver it no matter what obstacles the world puts in their path. You close the drawer containing the tax assessment and let your fingers trail along the spines of the books in the library. Leather and gilt, mostly, the kind of volumes that gentlemen bought by the yard to fill their shelves. But tucked among them, almost hidden, you spot something different. A book that's been used, really used, the spine cracked, the corners worn, pages marked with slips of paper. You pull it out carefully, and the title page tells you it's a pattern book, one of those architectural guides that flooded the market in the 18th century. But as you open it, you realize this copy is special. Someone has written in the margins. You settle into a chair by the window, the afternoon light is just beginning its slow decline, and you begin to read the annotations. The printed text is what you'd expect, elegant engravings of classical orders, measured drawings of window proportions, advice on the 5 architectural styles. But the handwriting in the margins tells a different story. It's practical, specific, the notes of someone who actually built things rather than just drew them. Next to a plate showing a typical sash window, someone has scribbled, "For afternoon rooms, set sill 3 inches lower than pattern, catches more low sun." Next to a diagram of a house plan, west rooms need deeper reveals, spread the light or it falls in a stripe. This book, you realize, belonged to a working architect, or maybe a master builder, and he used it to record what the pattern books left out. You turn pages, and the annotations grow more detailed. There's a sketch in one margin showing how to angle a window jamb to catch light from a particular direction, with calculations that seem to involve the sun's path at different seasons. Another note warns, clients always want more windows on street front. Fight them. Garden front matters more for living. And in the back, someone has pasted in a newspaper clipping about a court case, 2 neighbors disputing a new wing that would shadow a drawing room. The note beneath reads, "Always check eastern neighbors' plans. A new building can ruin 10 years' work." This book, you understand now, represents the real knowledge of Georgian architecture. Not the published rules and proportions, but the accumulated wisdom of people who spent their lives figuring out how to make light behave. The pattern books gave you the theory. The margins gave you the practice. And somewhere in between, in the gap between printed page and handwritten note, Georgian architects learned their craft. You find a section on window placement that's been almost entirely rewritten in the margin. The printed text recommends symmetry above all. Windows spaced evenly, aligned precisely, creating a regular facade. But the handwritten note says, symmetry for street only. Inside, follow the sun. Let windows fall where light demands, then adjust facade to hide it. You imagine the architect explaining this to a client, trying to justify a window that sits slightly off-center because that's where the afternoon light hits best. The client, trained by pattern books to expect regularity, would have objected. The architect, armed with marginal wisdom, would have persisted. And the resulting house, like this one, would look perfectly regular from the street while performing its light-catching magic inside. Another annotation catches your eye. This one more personal. Next to a plate showing a grand country house, Someone has written, "Built this for Lord C in 72. He insisted on cutting the west trees for view. Now drawing room dark by 3 p.m. Told him so. He doesn't invite me anymore." You smile at the note, imagining the architect's satisfaction at being proved right, even if it cost him a client. The margin is full of such small victories and defeats, the record of a career spent negotiating between what clients wanted and what the light demanded. You flip to a section on proportions, and here the annotations become almost mathematical. Someone has drawn diagrams showing how the height of a window relates to the depth of the room, with formulas for calculating how far light will penetrate at different times of day. The printed text gives simple ratios. A window should be half the width of the room, something like that. But the margin calculates, for afternoon sun at 45 degrees, light reaches 1.5 times window height. For winter sun at 20 degrees, reaches 3 times height. Design for winter, summer can be shaded. This is knowledge you won't find in any published source, knowledge earned through observation and measurement and the patient study of how light actually behaves. You find sketches of sun paths, drawn freehand, showing the arc of the sun across the sky at different latitudes. Someone has calculated the optimal orientation for a drawing room in London, in Bath, in Edinburgh, the angles shifting slightly with each location. The pattern books treated architecture as universal, applicable anywhere. The marginal notes treat it as local, responsive to specific places and specific skies. This architect, you realize, understood that a window that works in Bristol might fail in Newcastle, because the sun doesn't follow the same path. The back pages of the book contain something unexpected: letters, folded and slipped between the leaves. You unfold one carefully, and it's from a client, complaining that his new library is too dark in the afternoon. The architect's reply, drafted in the margin nearby, explains that the library faces north because books fade in direct sun, and if the client wants to read in afternoon light, he should use the drawing room. The client, apparently, was not mollified. You imagine the ongoing negotiation, the letters back and forth, the compromise that probably involved adding a west-facing bay to the library despite the risk to the books. Architects, you realize, spent as much time managing people as managing light. Historians still argue about how knowledge was transmitted in Georgian architecture. The formal view says that architects learn from pattern books and the Grand Tour, from studying classical ruins in Italy and applying those lessons at home. But this book suggests another path. Knowledge passed from builder to builder, from architect to apprentice, written in margins and whispered on sight. The real rules of Georgian architecture, the ones about light and orientation and the stubbornness of clients, never made it into print. They lived in books like this one, passed down through generations, accumulating wisdom like dust. You close the book carefully, feeling the weight of all those marginal notes. The printed pages are handsome, certainly, but the real value lies in the handwriting, the record of someone who spent a lifetime figuring out how to catch the afternoon light. You slip the book back onto the shelf, but you know you'll remember it. Every window in this house, every carefully positioned sash, every borrowed light and angled reveal, exists because someone wrote something in a margin. The pattern books got the credit. The margins did the work. You leave the library and walk toward the front of the house, but something makes you pause in the hallway. There's a small room here, tucked beside the entrance, that you haven't explored yet. You push the door open and find yourself in what must have been the architect's office. A room preserved, somehow, with its original furnishings intact. A drawing board stands by the window, angled to catch the north light that artists prefer because it doesn't cast shadows. Sheets of paper lie scattered across it, some blank, some covered with the delicate lines of architectural drawings. And on the windowsill, catching the last of the afternoon sun, sits a small brass instrument that makes you catch your breath. It's a pocket sundial, But not like the one the architect showed you on the rooftop. This one is more sophisticated, with adjustable plates for different latitudes and a compass built into its base. You pick it up carefully, feeling its weight, and you realize you're holding one of the tools that Georgian architects actually use to understand light. Not theory, not guesswork, but measurement. This little instrument could tell you exactly where the sun would be at any hour of any day, could help you calculate the angle of light through a window you hadn't even built yet. You're standing at the heart of the great debate. Did Georgian architects design by intuition or by instrument? You turn the sundial in your hands, examining its markings. They're precise, engraved by someone who knew their business, showing the hours and the seasons and the adjustments for different places. An architect traveling to a new site could consult this dial, could calculate the sun's path for that specific latitude, could position his building accordingly. This wasn't guesswork. This was science, applied to the ancient problem of catching light. And yet, as you look around the room, you see evidence of the other approach too. The drawing board holds sketches that aren't quite finished, and among the ruled lines and measured proportions, you notice something else. Small marks, almost casual, showing where the sun would fall at different times. The architect has drawn little sun symbols in the corners of some rooms, with arrows showing the direction of light. These aren't calculations. They're observations, intuitions, the architect imagining himself in the room at different hours and feeling where the light would land. The sundial gave him the science. His own mind gave him the art. And somewhere between the two, the building took shape. You search the room for more clues, and you find them everywhere. A shelf holds books on astronomy, their spines cracked from use, with more of those marginal notes you saw in the library. Another shelf holds pattern books, the kind with printed rules and proportions. A cabinet contains instruments, more sundials, a sextant, even something that looks like an early theodolite for measuring angles. This architect, whoever he was, took measurements seriously. He wanted to know exactly where the sun would be, exactly how deep the shadows would fall, exactly when the light would reach each window. But then you find his journals, stacked in a corner, and the story gets more complicated. The journals are full of measurements and calculations, certainly, but they're also full of something else. Descriptions of light at specific moments, in specific rooms, on specific days. October 15th, 4 p.m. One entry reads, "The light in the blue drawing room was the color of honey. It lasted exactly 47 minutes before fading. The window needs to be 6 inches wider to catch it longer." Another entry, June 21st, noon. "The morning room is unbearable. The eastern windows admit too much high sun. The client will need shutters." These aren't the notes of someone who relies entirely on instruments. They're the notes of someone who watches, who feels, who lets the light teach him. Historians still argue about which approach dominated. The instrument camp points to the surviving tools, the mathematical calculations, the precision of Georgian buildings. These people could measure, they argue, and they did measure, and their buildings reflect that precision. The intuition camp points to the journals, the observations, the way Georgian houses vary subtly in response to their specific sites. These people watch the light, they argue, and they learn from watching, and their buildings reflect that attention. The truth, as you hold this sundial in one hand and this journal in the other, seems to be that both camps are right. The best architects used both. They measured, and they watched. They calculated, and they felt. And the houses they built are better for it. You open the journal to a page that stops you. It's a drawing of this very house, or at least an early version of it, with notes in the margin about window placement. Next to each window, the architect has written two things: a calculation of the sun's angle at the winter solstice, and a description of how the light would feel. West drawing room window, 23 degrees at 4 p.m. December. Will fall across the sofa. The sitter will be warm. The calculation and the feeling, side by side. The instrument and the intuition, working together. You look out the window of this office, and you notice something you missed before. The window faces north, as it should for an artist's or architect's workspace, but it's not a simple opening. The reveal is angled slightly, just a few degrees, so that even north light, which should be constant and shadowless, gets directed in a particular way. The architect measured this, you realize. He calculated exactly how much angle he could give the reveal without admitting direct sun, and he built it that way. But he also sat at this desk, day after day, and felt whether the light was right. And if it wasn't, he would have changed it. The instruments guided him. His eyes judged. You think about the rooms you visited, the windows you've studied, the light you've watched pour through these openings. Each one represents a decision, a moment when someone had to choose between what the instruments said and what the eyes saw. The instruments gave you the sun's path, the angles, the calculations. But the eyes gave you the color, the warmth, the feeling of sitting in a pool of gold at the end of a long day. The Georgians needed both. They built with math and with love, and the houses remember. You set the sundial back on the windowsill, exactly where you found it. The afternoon light catches it one last time, glinting off the brass, throwing a tiny rainbow onto the wall. The architect who owned this would have seen that rainbow 1,000 times, would have watched it move across the room as the seasons changed. He would have measured it, probably, noted its position and duration. But he would also have simply enjoyed it, let it remind him why he did this work. Because light, in the end, isn't just something to be calculated. It's something to be felt. And the best architects, the ones whose houses still glow after 2 centuries, never forgot that. You leave the architect's office and walk back toward the drawing room, but something makes you hesitate at the threshold. The room looks different now. The light that poured through those western windows when you first arrived has faded, and the space has taken on the cool blue tone of early evening. You step inside and sit in the same chair where you started this journey, but everything has changed. The golden hour is over, and in its place is a quiet, reflective dimness that makes you think about time. Not just the time of day, but the time of year. This room in June, you realize, would be almost uninhabitable in the afternoon. So what did the Georgians do about that? You lean back in the chair and let your mind drift through the seasons. It's autumn now, or maybe early spring, and the afternoon sun is welcome. Warm without being oppressive, gentle without being weak. But imagine this same room in high summer, when the sun rides high and hot, when those western windows would act like magnifying glasses, concentrating the day's accumulated heat into a furnace of a room. The Georgians didn't have air conditioning. They didn't have electric fans. They had the same sun you have, and they had to figure out how to live with it through every season. You look around the room for clues, and they start to appear once you know what you're looking for. The shutters, first of all, those folding wooden panels that you barely noticed before, tucked into the window reveals. In summer, you realize, those shutters would be closed during the afternoon, blocking the sun before it could enter. The room would be dark, yes, but cool, the thick walls and closed shutters keeping the heat at bay until evening, when the worst of the sun had passed. Then, as the light softened, the shutters would be opened, letting in the last gentle rays before dinner. The Georgians didn't expect to use every room all day. They used rooms according to the season, migrating through their houses as the sun dictated. You stand and examine the shutters more closely. They're beautifully made, each louver adjustable so that you can control exactly how much light enters. In summer, you might close them completely, turning the drawing room into a cool, dark cave. In winter, you might open them wide, letting every possible ray penetrate. And in spring and autumn, you might angle the louvers to admit light while blocking the worst of the heat. These aren't just shutters. They're a seasonal tuning mechanism, as sophisticated as anything in the house. Above the shutters, you notice something else, the deep window reveal itself. In summer, when the sun is high, that deep reveal casts the upper part of the window into shadow, reducing the amount of direct light that enters. In winter, when the sun is low, the same reveal does nothing. The light streams straight in, unimpeded. The architect who designed this understood that a window isn't a static thing. It's a dynamic system, responding differently to different seasons, and the geometry of the reveal was calibrated to make those differences work in the occupant's favor. You walk to another window, one that faces south rather than west, and you see additional evidence of seasonal thinking. This window has an external hood, a shallow projection above it that casts a shadow at noon in summer but allows the lower winter sun to pass beneath. You've seen these on buildings before without really noticing them, but now they speak clearly. The Georgians thought about the sun's changing path, and they built devices to manage it. A house that worked in all seasons wasn't an accident. It was a design problem, and they solved it. Back in the drawing room, you examine the furniture with new eyes. The heavy chairs, the dark wood, the rich fabrics, these aren't just decorative choices. They're seasonal adaptations. In winter, when the room was flooded with low sun, those dark surfaces absorbed heat and radiated it back into the room. In summer, with the shutters closed and the room cool, the same furniture waited patiently for autumn. The Georgians didn't redecorate by season. They built rooms that could shift their function, that could be warm in winter and cool in summer simply by how they were used. You think about the family who lived here, moving through their year. In high summer, they would have abandoned the drawing room entirely in the afternoon, retreating to north-facing rooms or even to the garden, where shade and breezes offered relief. The drawing room would come alive again in the evening, when the worst heat had passed and the last light made its brief appearance. In winter, they would have clustered here all afternoon, chasing the sun as it moved across the room, positioning their chairs to catch each passing ray. The house wasn't a static backdrop to their lives. It was an active participant, shaping how they lived through every season. The servants, you realize, had an even more intimate relationship with these seasonal shifts. In summer, they would have closed those shutters at noon, darkening rooms that the family wouldn't use until evening. In winter, they would have opened everything wide, chasing every scrap of warmth and light. Their daily routines were dictated by the sun's position as surely as the families were, and they would have known, without ever being taught, which windows to open and which to close as the seasons turned. Historians still argue about how consciously the Georgians designed for seasonal change. Some point to the surviving pattern books, which rarely mention seasonal considerations, and argue that the adaptations were largely unconscious, simple responses to obvious problems rather than sophisticated design. Others point to the consistency of these features across thousands of houses and argue that they must have been intentional, taught and passed down through generations of builders. The truth, as usual, probably lies in between. Some architects thought about seasons explicitly. Others just built what they'd always built, and what they'd always built happened to work. You walk to the window one last time and look out at the darkening garden. The sun is gone now, but you understand something you didn't understand before. This house isn't just a machine for catching afternoon light. It's a machine for managing light across all the afternoons of the year, for responding to the sun's slow dance through the seasons. The golden hour you experienced earlier was just one moment in a year-long conversation between this building and the sky. And that conversation, you now realize, has been going on for centuries. It will continue long after you're gone. You turn from the window and walk slowly through the darkening house, your footsteps muffled by runners and carpets that have known these paths for generations. The rooms you visited earlier are quiet now, their furniture reduced to shadows, their windows blank mirrors reflecting nothing. You climb the stairs one last time, not to the drawing room or the library, but higher still, to the bedroom floor, where the family slept and dreamed. And here, in a room that faces west, you lie down on a bed that has held countless sleepers before you. The day is over, but the house is not done with you yet. You lie on your back, staring at the ceiling, and something extraordinary happens. The room is dark, dark enough that you can barely make out the shapes of furniture, but above you, the ceiling holds a faint glow. It's the ghost of the afternoon light, reflected and delayed, lingering in the plaster long after the sun itself has set. You watch it fade, slowly, imperceptibly, until even that memory of light is gone. But in its place, something else appears. The headlights of a passing car sweep across the ceiling, modern and electric, and for a moment you see the room as it exists now, in the 21st century, with all the changes that 200 years have brought. But when the car passes, the room returns to its older self, and you find your gaze drawn to the window. It's a sash window, of course. Every window in this house is a sash window, and even in the dark you can see its proportions, its 12/12 panes, its deep reveal. This window, you realize, was placed here for the same reason as the drawing room windows below. It catches the afternoon light. Not for entertaining, not for impressing guests, but for this, for lying in bed at the end of the day, watching the light play across the ceiling, feeling the day's warmth slowly seep away. The Georgians thought about everything. You think about your own bedroom, in your own house, in whatever city you call home. Does it catch the afternoon light? Did someone, 2 centuries ago or last year, think about where the sun would be at 4 o'clock when they cut that hole in the wall? You realize that you've never noticed before. You've lived with your windows for years without ever really seeing them, without ever asking what they were for beyond letting in air and looking out. But now, lying in this Georgian bed, you understand that a window is more than an opening. It's an instrument. And someone, somewhere, tuned it. The room settles around you, and you let your mind drift through everything you've learned. You've stood in medieval halls where windows were afterthoughts, narrow slits that kept the weather out but kept the light out too. You've climbed Georgian staircases designed as light scoops, funneling illumination to every floor. You've sat in oriel windows that curved around you like glass embraces, catching sun from every direction. You've traced the paths of borrowed light through corridors and cupboards, seen how a single window could serve a dozen rooms. You've held a pocket sundial in your palm and imagined an architect calculating angles, and you've read the marginal notes where that same architect recorded what his eyes told him. You've seen the hierarchy of light, how the best windows went to the best rooms and the best hours went to the best people. You've watched shadows from trees and neighbors steal the afternoon from rooms that were designed to hold it. You've understood how attacks on windows forced generations of builders to become geniuses of light distribution, how a piece of legislation shaped the way a whole nation saw the sun. You've held a pattern book in your hands and seen the real knowledge written in its margins, passed from builder to builder, never quite making it into print. And you've watched the seasons turn, seen how a room that glows in October would be uninhabitable in June, and understood that the Georgians built for the whole year, not just for the golden hour. And now you lie here, in the dark, in a room that held its afternoon light as long as it could and then let it go. The house is quiet around you. No servants moving, no family talking, no carriages passing in the street. Just you, and the ceiling, and the ghost of the sun. You think about all the people who have lain in this bed before you, watching this same ceiling darken. The Georgian gentleman who built this house, perhaps, calculating his investments and worrying about his crops. His wife, reading by the last of the light, reluctant to call for candles. Their children, scared of the dark, comforted by the slow fade of afternoon into evening. The servants, finally resting after 16 hours of work, stealing this one quiet moment before sleep. All of them watched this ceiling. All of them knew this light. You close your eyes, and the room dissolves. The house dissolves. You're floating now, in the space between waking and sleeping, where the boundaries between centuries blur. That window you just studied, that careful arrangement of glass and frame and reveal, it's still there, even in your drowsiness. You can feel its presence, the way it opened itself to the afternoon, the way it held the light and then released it. And you realize, with the kind of clarity that only comes at the edge of sleep, that this is what the Georgians wanted. Not just to catch the light, but to hold it long enough that it became part of you. To build rooms that would shape the way you experience time itself. Your own bedroom, wherever it is, has its own windows. They catch their own light, at their own hours, in their own way. Tomorrow afternoon, if you're home, you might notice them differently. You might watch the light move across your floor and think about the person who placed that window, about the decisions they made, about the afternoon sun that has been doing this same dance for billions of years. And you might feel, just for a moment, connected to all those Georgian sleepers who watched their own ceilings darken and thought their own thoughts. But that's tomorrow. For now, in this room, in this bed, in this house that has held so many dreams, you let go. The ceiling fades entirely. The window becomes a suggestion. The afternoon light, finally, completely, utterly, is gone. And you follow it, down into the darkness where all days go, to sleep the sleep of someone who has spent a day inside architecture, inside history, inside light itself. As you drift, the house settles around you like a great sleeping animal. The walls that held the afternoon's warmth now release it slowly, imperceptibly, into the cooling air. The windows stand quiet in their frames, their work done until tomorrow, when the sun will return and the whole performance will begin again. You're just a visitor here, a temporary occupant of this centuries-old machine for living. But for this one night, you're part of its story. The house remembers you now, as it remembers all the sleepers who came before. And when you wake, in the morning light that comes through east-facing windows you haven't even seen, you'll carry a piece of this place with you. The knowledge of how to catch the afternoon light, not just as an architectural fact, but as a way of being in the world. The Georgians built their houses to last, but they also built them to teach. And tonight, lying here in the darkness, you've finally learned the lesson. Sweet dreams.